Hello, and welcome to our spiritual devotion this Tuesday during Holy Week. My name is Pam Hrncir, and I'm the Covenant Pastor for Congregational Care at Williamsburg Presbyterian Church. Throughout Lent, we have been learning about African American spirituals, songs that grew out of African American enslavement from the transatlantic slave trade and subsequent U.S. domestic slave trade. It is a genre of music which is, and I quote, purely and solely the creation of generations of African Americans. The spirituals grew from their African American heritage, their experience of being enslaved, and the hope they found in God, who not only sustained them during bondage, but also promised liberation. I continue to learn more and more about our country's relationship with slavery and the ideology of white supremacy, and how both get tangled into our Christian values. I am very appreciative for this opportunity to learn more about this type of music, because it furthers my understanding of African American history and also deepens my understanding of our God, who is very present with those who suffer. Today, I chose to share about the spiritual, Were You There? This is a spiritual we have become very familiar with during Lent, often sung on Good Friday. Specifics of this song's history are unknown. It is believed this spiritual was written in the 1800s by an enslaved African, but also that this spiritual most certainly reflected the communal experience of all people enslaved during this time. The spiritual was first recorded in William Elizur Barton's 1899 Old Plantation Hymns. In 1940, the Episcopal Church was the first to include Were You There in their hymnal. Now, in the last 30 years, almost all hymnals include the spiritual Were You There? The original stanzas of the spiritual Were You There are this. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the cross? Were you there when they pierced him in the side? Were you there when the sun refused to shine? In later years, the stanza, Were you there when they laid him in the tomb, was also added. Now, according to the Methodist Church History on Hymns, this series of questions, and I quote, is meant to bring the past events of Christ's suffering and death into the present and transform us into light. While remembering Christ's suffering, we are called to remember the suffering of enslaved African Americans. James Cone, African American theologian and author of The Cross and the Lynching Tree, writes, quote, in the mystery of God's revelation, Black Christians believe that just knowing that Jesus went through an experience of suffering in a manner similar to theirs gave them faith that God was with them, even in suffering on lynching trees, just as God was present with Jesus, suffering on the cross, end quote. Trusting in God's presence during suffering leads us to God's resurrection power. As Were You There grew in popularity, it also became one of Mahatma Gandhi's favorite songs. Howard Thurman, African American pastor, author, and civil rights leader, shares a story of Mahatma Gandhi and the spiritual in his memoir, With Head and Heart. Thurman recalls, quote, but before we left, he asked, will you do me a favor? Will you sing one of your songs for me? Will you sing, Were You There when they crucified my Lord? Gandhi continued, I feel that this song gets to the root of the experience of the entire human race, under the spread of healing wings of suffering. What I find so interesting and hopeful about the origins of not just this spiritual, but all spirituals, are that these spirituals were born from a religion introduced to them to justify these people's enslavement. And instead, through the living word of the Bible, these enslaved people discovered a God value them and said to them, "You are worthy of being my children." The enslaved people discovered a God that says, "I chose you as my own." They discovered a God that stood in solidarity with their suffering, a God whose steadfast love and faithfulness promised these enslaved people liberation. They discovered that God promised that death and suffering will not have the last word, and that God acts on behalf of all humanity to break the power of sin and evil through the resurrection. When I hear this song now, the words are much more provoking. I remember Christ, and I remember African Americans enduring enslavement, enduring the Jim Crow era, the lynchings, and the ongoing work to reshape our mindset on racism and its long-term effects. I also remember those who lived here in our country originally, who lost their way of life, who were forced to live on reservations. I remember the trail of tears. And I remember those who lost loved ones and who suffered during Argentina's dirty war and Operation Condor in South America. I remember the Holocaust. I remember what's happening in Myanmar, in Yemen, in Tigray, Palestine, the Uyghurs in China. I remember those kidnapped by Boko Haram. I remember what we as human beings are capable of when we do not worship God and follow in God's way of compassion and justice. I remember God knows our pain. Whoever wrote and sang the spiritual "Were You There" wrote from a place of experience, a place when the sun didn't shine, where they themselves trembled. The song grips us, speaks to our soul, because we know the experience of deep suffering, either personally or we have been in solidarity with someone who is suffering. The song speaks to us because our God knows our sufferings and therefore is with us and all who suffer. I invite you to our Tenebrae service this Friday. When the spiritual is sung, let it speak to you. How does the spiritual of Christ's suffering transform us into the light? What does Mahatma Gandhi mean by healing wings of suffering? And if you're suffering, if the sun is not shining, know that God is with you and Easter is coming. Amen.